If Adolf Hitler could see the world in 2026, he would probably encounter a reality that would be profoundly bewildering to him. The planet he once tried to dominate has transformed into a global society where cultural boundaries blend, technology connects millions of people in seconds, and many of the ideas he championed have been rejected by much of humanity. From established democracies to scientific advancements unimaginable in his time, the current world is almost the opposite of the order he tried to impose. Here are 10 things about the modern world that would undoubtedly leave him completely astonished and even terrified. Hitler did not want Berlin. He wanted to suppress it and build over its ruins an entirely new city that would be called Germania. The plan, assigned to architect Albert Speer in January 1937, whom Hitler officially appointed as General Inspector of Construction of the Reich, was developed with an obsession that Speer himself, in his later memoirs, described as the only genuinely playful activity he saw in Hitler during years of daily interaction. Discussions about the reconstruction plans for Berlin were, according to Joseph Goebbels' diary in September 1937, the nights when Hitler seemed most relaxed. The Führer does not talk about money. Build, build, somehow it will pay for itself. It was a project where his two obsessions merged, racial power expressed in stone and immortality through architecture. The north-south axis of Germania would be 7 kilometers long and 120 meters wide, more than twice the width of the Champs-Élysées in Paris. At the northern end would rise the Volkshalle, the Great Hall of the People, with a dome 221 meters high, 3 times the dome of St. Peter's in the Vatican, and 290 meters in diameter, capable of holding 180,000 people standing. The regime's own climatologists warned Speer that the human respiration of that crowd would generate enough humidity to produce internal condensation clouds and rain inside the building. The architectural calculation was not a flaw, it was the perfectly articulated psychological intention. Every person entering that building was meant to feel insignificant in the immensity of Germanic power. Hitler described it to his collaborators. The citizen should leave convinced that he was a nobody, that no one would support him, and that no individual resistance was possible against such a colossal reality. The triumphal arch projected for the southern end of the axis would be 110 meters high and 270 meters wide. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris measures 49 meters high. Engraved inside would be the names of the 1,800,000 German soldiers who died in World War I. 2 years before the Second World War began, the land was already being cleared and some pre-existing structures had been demolished. The Reichstag itself, the building that in 1933 had been set on fire as a pretext for the state of emergency, was, in Speer's plans, a relic destined to be reduced to a minor historical monument on the margins of the new imperial capital. To understand how deep the contrast is with Berlin in 2026, it is necessary to grasp what post-war reconstruction meant from a philosophical point of view. The decision to preserve the Reichstag and rehabilitate it as the seat of the reunified German parliament was made in 1991 after decades of debate. The building had been left in ruins since the 1933 fire and the 1945 bombings, and during the division of Germany it was in no man's land, literally next to the Berlin Wall. Rehabilitating it and making it the Bundestag was a political act of symbolic recovery. The glass dome, designed by Sir Norman Foster, inaugurated in April 1999, was the result of an international competition seeking to architecturally express the values of the new republic. The design allows natural light to illuminate the plenary hall from above and lets citizens walk in a spiral around a cone of mirrors in the center, observing parliamentary sessions from above. The transparency is not metaphorical, it is structural. At number 4, Niederkirchner Straße in the Kreuzberg district is today the Topography of Terror, one of Germany's most visited historical museums with over 1 million visitors annually. The building is constructed on the foundations of the former headquarters of the Gestapo, the Reich Security Service, and the SD, the SS Intelligence Service. Excavations carried out during construction exposed the original cellars where interrogations and torture took place between 1933 and 1945. Those cellars are now under a glass cover and accessible to the public as part of the permanent exhibition. In the center of what was to be the capital of the German millennium, the only surviving cellars of the regime are those that document its crimes. The Holocaust Memorial, officially called the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, was inaugurated on May 10, 2005, in the heart of Berlin, less than 300 meters from the Brandenburg Gate. Its 2,711 concrete stelae of varying heights, from 50 centimeters to 4 meters 80 centimeters, occupy 19,000 square meters on what was once East German territory, just meters from where the Führer bunker stood in 1945. The designer, American architect Peter Eisenman, explained that the maze of stelae is intended to produce disorientation and a sense of instability for those who walk through it, the same instability suffered by the victims. In 2026, the most prominent place in Berlin's historic center is a monument to those murdered by Hitler's regime, exactly where he wanted his triumphal arch. The map, shrunken Germany. In 1939, when Hitler had absolute control of the Reich, the territory under German dominion included Germany itself, with the Czech Sudetenland incorporated in October 1938, and the rest of Bohemia and Moravia turned into a protectorate in March 1939, and Austria, annexed through the March 1938 Anschluss. The controlled area exceeded 580,000 square kilometers, but that was only the starting point. The Lebensraum that Hitler had precisely articulated in Mein Kampf, and which his own ideological analysis deemed inevitable, required the conquest of Eastern European territories: Ukraine, the Volga Basin, the Baltic territories. In private conversations in August 1941, during the Soviet invasion, Hitler described to his collaborators a vision of the future in which 250 million Germans and Germanic settlers would populate the East up to the Urals within 70 or 80 years. The Volga would be the new Mississippi, as he himself expressed. Germany in 2026 has 357,114 square kilometers. It is not only smaller than Germany of 1937 in terms of area, it is radically different in terms of composition. The territories that Hitler considered the irreplaceable historical core of the Reich are today outside any German jurisdiction, not due to a provisional treaty, but because of a geopolitical redefinition that no serious political actor within Germany questions. East Prussia, the territory that for centuries functioned as the symbolic heart of Prussian and German military identity, is today divided into two parts with completely different statuses. The southern half became Polish territory in 1945, now home to the cities of Olsztyn, the former Allenstein, and Elbląg, the former Elbing. The northern half was incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1946 and renamed Kaliningrad Oblast, a territory that since 1991 has been part of the Russian Federation as an enclave separate from mainland Russia. Königsberg, renamed Kaliningrad by the Soviets in honor of Presidium Chairman Mikhail Kalinin, had a population of approximately 365,000 in 1939, almost all German. The mass deportation and flight of the German population between 1944 and 1948 turned it into a Russian city. The University of Königsberg, founded in 1544 and associated with philosopher Immanuel Kant for decades, was closed in 1945. Today there is the University of Kaliningrad, which has carried Kant's name only since 2005. Silesia, the industrial region where in 1939 a crucial part of the Reich's coal and steel production was concentrated, was divided in 1945 between Poland and Czechoslovakia. Polish Upper Silesia, with its capital Katowice, today produces 80% of Poland's coal. Breslau, which Hitler knew as one of the most important cities of the Reich, and which in February 1945 he declared a fortress to be defended to the death, an order that cost tens of thousands of civilians and soldiers their lives in a 78-day siege, is today called Rockwar, is the second largest city in Poland by area and houses one of the country's most active universities with over 120,000 enrolled students. Danzig, today Gdansk, deserves a special mention in this inventory of historical ironies. It was the city whose incorporation into the Reich served as the formal trigger for the start of the war on September 1, 1939. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein, docked at the port under the pretext of a courtesy visit since August 25th, opened fire at 4:47 a.m. on the Polish ammunition depot at Westerplatte. 40 years later, in August 1980, it was at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, the same shipyard where workers built ships for the Kriegsmarine under German occupation, that electrician Lech Wałęsa and other labor activists founded the independent union Solidarność. This movement, born in the city that Hitler used as a pretext to unleash the greatest war in history, was the first link in the process that between 1989 and 1991 dismantled the Soviet communist bloc in Eastern Europe. The city that was the first shot of the war ended up being the first spark that dissolved one of its most enduring legacies. Austria, which Hitler annexed in 1938, proclaiming the unity of all Germans, signed the Austrian State Treaty on May 15, 1955, which restored its full sovereignty and imposed permanent neutrality as a constitutional condition. That neutrality, enshrined in the Constitution in October 1955, was the price for the withdrawal of Soviet and Western occupation troops. Austria became a UN member that same year, joined the European Union in 1995, and Vienna today hosts international organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. The imperial city where Hitler arrived as an artistic beggar at 17, and from which he was expelled humiliated twice by the Academy of Fine Arts, is today one of the world's diplomatic capitals. The difference between the map Hitler had in mind and the map that exists in 2026 is not only geographical. It is the difference between two incompatible conceptions of how power is organized in the world. Hitler believed that territory is won by force and that history is written by the strong races that conquer the weak. The map of 2026 was drawn by treaties, international institutions, and cooperation among the very countries he wanted to annihilate or subjugate. And that map, unlike all the borders Hitler drew, has remained stable for 80 years. Alliances, enemies sitting at the same table. In Mein Kampf, Hitler identified France with the following precision. France is and remains Germany's most terrible enemy. For that reason, every victory Germany needs in Europe is primarily a victory over France. It was not a tactical position adjustable according to circumstances, it was a racial and civilizational conviction. France represented the danger of contamination because of its tolerance for racial mixing, especially with the African population of its colonies, and as long as it existed as a power, it blocked any aspiration for Germanic hegemony in Western Europe. In his speeches of the 1920s, recorded by historian Ian Kershaw, Hitler even used the term annihilate, vernichten, when speaking of France, with the same forcefulness as when he spoke of Marxism or the Jews. On June 21, 1940, at 3:15 in the afternoon, Hitler arrived at the Compiègne forest clearing in northern France and boarded the dining car of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, No. 2419D, where Marshal Ferdinand Foch had dictated the terms of the German armistice on November 11, 1918. Hitler had ordered that the car, preserved as a museum piece, be recovered from its pavilion and placed exactly at the same spot it had occupied in 1918. He listened for 10 minutes to the reading of the armistice preamble without uttering a single word. Then he left. According to his own account to Goebbels that night, he was dominated by the feeling of revenge for the humiliation of November 1918. The next day, he ordered the car destroyed and the monument at the clearing demolished. Only Foch's statue was preserved. The humiliation of France was, for him, an existential victory. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The ignominy is extinguished. It is a sensation of being reborn." Hitler's visit to Paris on June 28, 1940, lasted less than 3 hours. He arrived at Le Bourget airport at 5:30 in the morning before most Parisians had awakened. Accompanied by Speer, architect Hermann Giesler, and sculptor Arno Breker, he toured the Opera, the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, and the Tuileries. At the Invalides, he stopped silently before Napoleon's tomb for an extended period. Returning to his headquarters, he told Speer that seeing Paris had been the dream of his life. But he also confided that he had considered destroying it. Finally, he said, "When we finish Berlin, Paris will be nothing but a shadow. Why should I destroy it?" In 2026, France and Germany are the backbone of the European Union, a supranational entity managing an internal market of over 450 million people, a common currency, the euro, and growing coordination in foreign policy and defense. The Élysée Treaty was signed on January 22, 1963, exactly 22 years and 8 months after Hitler sat in the Compiègne car. Adenauer and de Gaulle signed it as the foundation of a reconciliation that both leaders considered necessary to prevent Europe from again becoming the scene of wars between its own nations. The treaty established mandatory bilateral consultations before any major political decision, large-scale student exchanges. The Franco-German Youth Office has organized exchanges for more than 8 million young people since 1963, and permanent military cooperation. The Franco-German Brigade, created in 1989 and now integrated into the Eurocorps based in Strasbourg, is a unit of 5,000 soldiers where French and German troops serve simultaneously under rotating shared command. In practice, the soldiers of the two countries that had faced each other most frequently in European wars between 1870 and 1945 now share barracks, training and operations. The Eurocorps has deployed forces in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and in European Union missions in the Sahel. The case of the United Kingdom reveals one of the deepest contradictions in Hitler's psychology. Ian Kershaw documents that Hitler admired the British with an almost obsessive intensity. He considered them a Germanic race that had demonstrated through their colonial empire what a superior race could achieve. In his private conversations in 1941, he compared the future German dominion of Eastern Europe with British control of India. With 250,000 men, the English rule 400 million Indians, he said. What India was for England, the Eastern Territory will be for us. That admiration coexisted with the rage of someone who felt rejected by whom he considered a natural ally. The 1935 Anglo-German naval agreement had been, for Hitler, one of the most hopeful moments of his foreign policy. He thought it opened the door to an alliance that would free Germany from having to fight on two fronts. When Churchill rejected any negotiation in the summer of 1940, Kershaw describes Hitler as a jilted lover, someone whose ardor gradually turned into resentment. Today, the British Ministry of Defence is headquartered in the same Whitehall where Churchill coordinated the resistance against Hitler. Her Majesty's troops participate regularly in joint exercises with the Bundeswehr. At RAF Bryce Norton Air Base in Oxfordshire, there are joint training procedures with Luftwaffe pilots, the name Germany has maintained for its air force since 1956, the same name Hitler used for the military aviation that bombed London. At the NATO summit in June 2024 in Washington, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak shared the table with 29 other allies in what is structurally the most powerful military alliance in human history. It includes all the countries that Hitler wanted to dominate, neutralize, or destroy. The United States deserves particular reflection because Hitler had an ambivalent and fundamentally erroneous view of Americans that influenced some of his worst strategic mistakes. He despised American democracy as a corrupt system controlled by Jewish interests. Roosevelt was, for him, Judaism personified, but at the same time admired certain aspects of American society. The racial segregation laws of the South, which he considered a practical application of racial purity principles similar to his own, and the conquest of the West, which he interpreted as a model of racial colonization equivalent to what he planned for Eastern Europe. He declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, without Washington having declared war first, a decision his own generals considered a strategic error with catastrophic consequences. Today, Ramstein Air Base in Rhineland-Palatinate is the largest U.S. military complex outside continental United States territory. It houses the U.S. Air Forces in Europe Command and NATO's Combined Air Operations Center, the node from which Allied air operations in Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia are coordinated. The 35,500 U.S. soldiers permanently stationed in Germany are not a residual occupation force. They are part of the security architecture that Germany deliberately chose as a guarantee of its own democratic order. The army, the Wehrmacht reduced to a pocket. German rearmament was the first concrete political decision Hitler made as Chancellor. On February 3, 1933, just 4 days after taking office, he secretly summoned the military chiefs of the Reichswehr, the army of 100,000 men permitted by the Treaty of Versailles, and outlined his plans: rapid rearmament, recovery of military sovereignty, and on the horizon, the conquest of living space in the East. General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense, supported the agenda from the outset. According to historian Kershaw, that February 3rd meeting was crucial because it established the primacy of rearmament over any other consideration of economic or foreign policy, without any of the ministers present raising a voice in opposition. The German defense budget rose from 700 to 800 million Reichsmarks annually during the Weimar Republic to figures that economist Hjalmar Schacht, then president of the Reichsbank, described as astronomical when implemented through a system of secretly financed debt bonds, the Mefo bills, which hid the real expenditure from external scrutiny. In March 1935, Hitler publicly announced the reinstatement of mandatory military service and the goal of a peacetime army of 36 divisions, 550,000 men, 5.5 times the Versailles limit. By 1939, the Wehrmacht already exceeded 1.5 million personnel in peacetime. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, represented the largest military deployment in human history up to that date. Hitler himself reviewed the campaign objectives on December 5, 1940, with General Franz Halder and the Chief of the Army, Walter von Brauchitsch. At that meeting, he said exactly this, recorded in Halder's diary: "The Russian is inferior, the army lacks leadership. Once the Russian army is struck, the final disaster is inevitable." On June 22, 150 divisions crossed the Soviet border, distributed among 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, along a total front of more than 3,000 kilometers. Including armored units, artillery, aviation, and support, the Axis mobilized more than 4 million soldiers that single day, counting Allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Finnish forces. The panzer divisions leading the advance numbered more than 3,350 operational tanks. In his private conversations in August 1941, when the invasion seemed to be proceeding according to plan, Hitler described the social order he expected to establish in the conquered territories. The scheme was feudal in structure. Military farms granted to soldiers who had completed 12 years of service would populate southern Ukraine and Crimea. Slavic inhabitants would be deported somewhere without further consideration. A permanent army of 1.5 to 2 million men stationed along a living wall of soldier colonists in the Urals would maintain control. If uprisings occurred, it would suffice to drop some bombs on their cities and the matter will be resolved. Russia would be to Germany what India had been to England, a captive market, a source of raw materials, and a field to demonstrate racial power. On the horizon, 250 million Germans in 70 or 80 years. That army of 4 million does not exist. The Bundeswehr was created on November 12, 1955, exactly 10 years after the end of the war, within the NATO framework and under the doctrine of innere Führung, internal leadership, a concept deliberately opposed to Prussian militarism. Innere Führung defines the German soldier as a citizen in uniform, whose loyalty is to the Constitution and not to any personal supreme commander. Every Bundeswehr soldier has the explicit right and obligation to disobey orders that violate the law or the Constitution. The conscientious objection system was incorporated directly into the Basic Law of 1949 in Article 4, Paragraph 3. No army in the world has such an architecture of legitimate disobedience so explicitly inscribed in its legal foundation. The 300 operational Leopard 2s of the Bundeswehr are among the most capable armored platforms in the world per unit, with state-of-the-art protection, thermal targeting systems, and a firing range over 4 kilometers. But there are 300. In the Battle of Kursk, from July 5 to 23, 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the Wehrmacht deployed approximately 2,700 tanks across a 250-kilometer front. The Soviets had a similar number. The result was an industrial slaughter that cost Germany the last strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The paradox Hitler would encounter in 2026 goes beyond the numbers. The Bundeswehr is not only small compared to the Wehrmacht, it is conceptually its opposite. The very designation is significant. Wehrmacht means defensive force of the people in German, but in practice it was the instrument of the most devastating aggression in modern history. Bundeswehr means federal defensive force, and in practice operates exclusively within multilateral frameworks of collective security. Since 1955, Germany has never initiated a unilateral military operation. Every deployment, Bosnia in the 90s, Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan since 2001, has been part of operations authorized by NATO or the United Nations. The country that built the deadliest army in history in 12 years decided after its defeat that collective security was more valuable than unilateral supremacy and has maintained that decision for 80 consecutive years. Poland closes this chapter in the most ironic way. On September 1, 1939, at 4:47 a.m., the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Westerplatte. The Polish state was crushed in 17 days between the Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army, whose intervention from the east was made possible by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed on August 23, 1939. In 2024, Poland invested 4.12% of its GDP in defense, the highest percentage in NATO. The Polish army is in the process of receiving contracts for more tanks than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom have in active service combined. The Polish defense doctrine is offensive in conception, not to wait to be attacked, but to have the capability to respond with decisive force from the first minute. The reason for this doctrine is inscribed in the national memory of September 1, 1939. Poland, the inferior that armed more than anyone. The Poles will not build any lasting state. That goes against their character. This is a summary of the systematic contempt Hitler expressed toward the Poles throughout his life, recorded in numerous table conversations transcribed by Martin Bormann between 1941 and 1944, published as the Bormann-Vermerke. The Poles, like the rest of the Slavs, were classified within the Nazi racial hierarchy as Untermenschen, subhumans, fit only for servitude to German colonizers. In Mein Kampf, he specifically pointed to the eastern plains as the destination for German Lebensraum. But Hitler did not always treat Poland as a declared enemy. Between 1934 and 1939, there was a tactical phase of apparent détente. The German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact, signed on January 26, 1934, was presented to the world as proof that Hitler was a responsible statesman, capable of resolving disputes diplomatically. For the Poles, it was a guarantee of 5 years of tranquility. For Hitler, it was an instrument to isolate France from its eastern allies and buy time to rearm. According to the Polish ambassador in Berlin, Józef Lipski, in those years, in Hitlerian circles, talk of a new German-Polish friendship was common. It was a disguise. On May 23, 1939, in a private meeting with his military chiefs, Hitler declared unambiguously that the Polish problem is inseparable from the conflict with the West, and that the intention was to attack Poland at the first convenient opportunity. 4 months later, he did. The attack on September 1, 1939, was executed with that contempt as its operational backdrop. At 4:45 a.m., the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had been docked in the port of Danzig since August 25th under the pretext of a courtesy visit, opened fire on the Polish ammunition depot at Westerplatte, defended by 182 Polish soldiers. That small garrison resisted for 7 days against vastly superior forces. Its commander, Major Henryk Sucharski, became one of the first symbols of Polish resistance. The Polish state was militarily crushed in 17 days of main combat, with Soviet intervention from the east on September 17th, sealing the defeat after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The German occupation of Poland was the most brutal of any conquered territory in Europe. The General Plan Ost, developed by the SS from 1941, envisioned in its most developed version the elimination or expulsion of 80% of the Polish population over a period of 20 to 30 years, to be replaced by German settlers. It is estimated that approximately 6 million Polish citizens died between 1939 and 1945, about half of whom were Polish Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and the other half ethnic Poles executed, starved, deported, or victims of reprisal operations. This represented 17% of Poland's total population in 1939. No other occupied European nation suffered a similar proportion of casualties. The brutality was systematic from day one. Kershaw documents that the Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS extermination units, began their mass killing operations in Poland in September 1939, ultimately claiming some 60,000 victims in the first weeks of occupation. The Polish elites, officers, priests, professors, judges, doctors, were identified and methodically eliminated under Operation AB and similar plans designed to decapitate any potential national resistance. Auschwitz concentration camp was originally established in June 1940 as a terror camp for Polish political prisoners, before becoming the largest extermination center of the Holocaust. In 2026, the contrast is of a magnitude that requires attention to every element. The Polish army is in the midst of the largest conventional force expansion undertaken by any NATO member in recent history. Contracts signed between 2022 and 2024 include 980 South Korean-made K-2 tanks, the first 250 delivered directly from South Korea, the remainder produced under license in Poland, and 250 American M1A2 SEPV-3 Abrams tanks. When the inventory is complete, Poland will have more tanks than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom combined. Not as a theoretical paper figure, but as operational platforms with trained crews. The artillery program is equally extraordinary. Poland has acquired 648 K-9 Thunder self-propelled howitzers from South Korea in addition to K-239 Chunmoo long-range rocket systems and American M270 MLRS and M142 HIMARS multiple rocket launchers. The 48 FA-50 fighters of the Polish Air Force, plus the 96 F-35A Lightning II contracted from Lockheed Martin with deliveries beginning in 2024, replace a fleet that just 15 years ago was mostly Soviet. The F-35 is the most advanced fifth-generation fighter in service in the world, equipped with stealth, sensor fusion, and electronic warfare capabilities that place it in a category entirely separate from anything that existed in World War II. The NATO Multinational Corps Northeast Command Base in Szczecin, the former German Stettin, serves as the coordination hub for the alliance's eastern flank. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Poland permanently hosts combat troops from 8 different countries on rotation within NATO's enhanced forward presence, including the first US combat division permanently deployed on European soil since the end of the Cold War. The 1st Cavalry Division Armored Brigade Combat Team established at the Drawsko-Pomorsky training ground since 2022. Hitler believed Poland could be crushed in weeks. Its ideological legacy faces in 2026 one of the most modern and best-equipped armies on the continent. Slavs armed by Germany, the ultimate irony. On June 22, 1941, at 3 in the morning, the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop summoned the Soviet ambassador Vladimir Dekhanozov to the Foreign Ministry in Berlin and handed him the declaration of war. At that same hour, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers were crossing the Soviet border along a front of over 3,000 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa, renamed in honor of Emperor Frederick I, who according to German legend slept in the Kyffhäuser Mountains waiting for the moment to be reborn and led Germany to glory, was the largest military operation in human history. On December 5, 1940, when Hitler outlined it to his generals Brauchitsch and Halder, he had said, "The Russian is inferior. The army lacks leadership. Once the Russian army is struck, the final disaster is inevitable." The Soviet-German War was the most devastating theater of World War II and of all known military history. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff between 1938 and 1942, noted in his diary on August 11, 1941, when the German advance had lasted only 7 weeks. The initial calculation of the campaign against Russia has been crushed. 360 Soviet divisions had been identified. Before the start of the campaign, German intelligence had estimated roughly 200. Every time 10 Soviet divisions were destroyed, another 10 appeared. The Soviet Union was not a crumbling building to kick from outside. It was an organism capable of absorbing unimaginable losses and continuing to fight. The USSR lost approximately 27 million people between 1941 and 1945, the highest number of any nation in the conflict. Of these, around 8.5 million were military deaths in combat. The rest were civilians massacred, victims of famine, bombings, deportations, and summary executions in occupied territories. Entire cities were destroyed. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble during the siege from August 1942 to February 1943, where the 6th German Army of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, 330,000 men at the start of the battle, was almost completely destroyed, with approximately 90,000 prisoners captured in February 1943. It was the Wehrmacht's first major strategic defeat, the definitive turning point on the Eastern Front, that it was the Soviet Union, a Slavic nation, that defeated Hitler's Germany in the decisive theater of the war, occupied Berlin on May 2, 1945, and in the following decades dominated Eastern Europe militarily, is one of the greatest structural ironies of 20th century history. Hitler had launched Barbarossa convinced he would conquer that territory in 8 to 10 weeks and turn it into the Reich's granary and living space for the coming centuries. Instead, Soviet troops remained in East Germany for 45 years, until August 31, 1994, when the last Russian soldier left German territory after reunification. But the irony that in 2026 would be hardest for Hitler to process is not historical. It is present and operational. Since February 24, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, another Slavic nation, exactly the territory Hitler intended to be the heart of German Lebensraum, Germany became one of the main arms suppliers to the Ukrainian army. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's decision to authorize the shipment of offensive weapons to Ukraine represented a historic shift in German foreign policy, which since 1945 had maintained the absolute principle of not exporting arms to active conflict zones. The systems transferred are top tier. The PZH-2000, Panzerhaubitze 2000, self-propelled howitzers are considered by multiple military analysts to be the most accurate and fastest-firing self-propelled guns in the Western world, capable of firing at distances of up to 40 kilometers with precision ammunition. The Leopard 1 A5S, delivered in 2023, are tanks whose direct genealogy stems from the Bundeswehr rearmament program of the 1960s, developed to defend Western Europe from a hypothetical Soviet advance. They are now the same tanks firing on Russian positions in the Donbas. The Leopard 2A6, the most modern version of the German armored vehicle, was sent from January 2023 following a coordinated decision with several NATO allies. The total amount of German military aid to Ukraine exceeded 28 billion euros accumulated by the end of 2024, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which monitors and publishes monthly the support commitments to Ukraine of all donor countries. To frame the paradox in terms Hitler would have understood, in summer 1941 dinner table conversations, collected and published by Martin Bormann, Hitler described the future of Ukraine in terms summarized by Kershaw. Southern Ukraine, particularly Crimea, would be populated by German soldier farmers. The existing inhabitants would be deported somewhere without further consideration. The territory where Hitler planned to install his German colonization military farms is the same where, in 2026, the German army trained Ukrainian soldiers in the handling of their weapon systems, at bases located in German territory such as the Grafenwöhr training area in Bavaria. The political and military heirs of the same state Hitler built are today training the inhabitants of the territory he wanted to exterminate or enslave. The SS Leibstandarte Reconnaissance Battalion, the unit that in the summer of 1941 advanced through Ukraine massacring civilians and burning villages as part of the systematic terror policy of the Ost, has as its institutional successor in the German narrative not a combat unit, but the Bundeswehr's Center for Multinational Operations Studies in Potsdam, which develops military cooperation doctrine with Slavic allies. The transformation is not only political, it is a complete inversion of the purpose of the institutions. Israel, the state of those he tried to exterminate. On January 30, 1939, the 6th anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler addressed the Reichstag and delivered what he himself called a prophecy. If international Jewish finance inside and outside Europe succeeds once more in plunging the nations into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thereby the victory of Judaism, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Kershaw emphasizes that Hitler repeated this prophecy in at least 6 speeches and important documents between 1941 and 1943 and systematically misdated it. He always placed it on September 1st, 1939, the day the war began. The error was unconscious but revealing. In his mind, the war and the extermination of the Jews were an inseparable unit from the very beginning. The operationalization of that prophecy went through several documented phases. In the summer of 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union underway and the Einsatzgruppen already carrying out mass killings in the occupied Soviet territories, the largest being Babi Yar in Kiev, where on September 29th and 30th, 1941, 33,771 Jews were murdered in 2 days, the machinery radicalized. The Wannsee Conference on January 20th, 1942, was convened by the chief of the Reich Main Security Office, SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, with the formal authorization of Hermann Göring, who acted as Hitler's delegate for the Jewish question on July 31st, 1941. At the villa on Wannseestrasse 56-58, Heydrich presented to representatives of 11 Reich ministries and institutions the plan for the evacuation, an operational euphemism for murder, of the 11 million Jews living throughout Europe, including countries outside German control such as the United Kingdom, Ireland, Switzerland, and the territories of French North Africa. The 6 extermination centers built in occupied Polish territory, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Bełżec, Sobibor, Chełmno, and Majdanek, operated as industrial murder facilities. Treblinka, located in northeastern Poland, was designed exclusively for killing. There were no work barracks or selection processes. Trains arrived, passengers were led to gas chambers and killed with carbon monoxide produced by diesel engines. Between July 1942 and August 1943, approximately 700,000 to 900,000 people were murdered at Treblinka, mostly Jews from the Warsaw District. A handful of survivors staged a revolt on August 2, 1943. The camp was dismantled weeks later to hide the evidence. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest complex, operated from 1940 to January 1945 with 4 gas chambers capable of killing thousands simultaneously, each equipped with crematoria. Rudolf Höss, the camp commander between 1940 and 1943, stated at Nuremberg that approximately 2.5 million people had been killed there. Later studies adjusted the figure to between 1.1 and 1.5 million, about 90% of whom were Jewish. Kershaw also notes Hitler's attitude toward the idea of a Jewish state before the war. In 1937 to 1938, the SS Security Service, the SD, under Adolf Eichmann, had secretly contacted Zionist activists to explore the possibility of accelerating Jewish emigration to Palestine. Eichmann's visit to Palestine was, in his own words, a total failure. The German Foreign Ministry was decidedly hostile to the creation of a Jewish state. Hitler himself, although initially favoring Palestine as an emigration destination, warned his collaborators that a strong Jewish state would threaten Germany in the future. Nazi anti-Semitism ran so deep that it instrumentally opposed any solution that might give organized power to the people it sought to destroy. On May 14, 1948, 3 years and 14 days after Hitler's suicide, David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel at the Tel Aviv Museum before 250 people gathered under a portrait of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism. Ben-Gurion concluded the reading at 4:16 p.m. 11 minutes later, U.S. President Harry Truman recognized the new state. 17 hours after the proclamation, 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded Israeli territory. The First Arab-Israeli War lasted until July 1949 and ended with armistice agreements that left Israel with more territory than allocated under the United Nations Partition Plan of November 1947. Holocaust survivors were fundamental in building the new state and its army. Hannah Senes, a poet and paratrooper captured and executed in Budapest in 1944, is today a national Israeli figure. Moshe Dayan, military commander of Israel's first generation and Minister of Defense in 1967, was born into a family of immigrants from the Russian Empire. Ariel Sharon, whose father had been born in Brest-Litovsk, The same Belarusian city where Germany imposed a humiliating treaty on Russia in 1918 was one of Israel's most decorated military commanders and later became prime minister. The generation that built the Israeli army was literally composed of survivors and children of survivors of Nazi persecution. In 2026, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, have approximately 170,000 active personnel and a reserve mobilizable up to 465,000 within 72 hours in a country of about 9.5 million inhabitants. The proportion of citizens in active service or immediately mobilizable reserve is one of the highest in the world. Military service is mandatory for men and women. Men serve 32 months, women 24. The integration of women into combat units, including infantry brigades such as the Caracal Brigade and mixed special forces units, is another exact inversion of the ideological order Hitler projected onto the world. The Iron Dome, a short-range missile defense system developed with US financial support and operational since 2011, intercepts rockets and artillery projectiles with a success rate officially above 90% under combat conditions, according to manufacturers Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries. The system is deployed in fixed and mobile batteries throughout Israeli territory. During escalations with Gaza in May 2021, the Iron Dome intercepted more than 1,400 projectiles in 11 days. This defensive capability did not exist in any army during World War II and would not have been possible without advances in electronics, computing, and rocket propulsion developed in the following decades, many by engineers and scientists from the same Ashkenazi world that Hitler attempted to exterminate. The Israeli nuclear program, managed under the doctrine of nuclear ambiguity, established by Prime Minister Levi Eshkol in the 1960s and maintained by all his successors, has not been officially confirmed. The Dimona nuclear reactor in the Negev desert was built between 1958 and 1963 with French technical assistance. In 1986, Israeli nuclear technician Mordecai Vanunu revealed program details to the London Sunday Times, including photographs taken inside the facilities. Academic institutions such as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists estimate that Israel possesses between 80 and 90 nuclear warheads, deliverable via Jericho 3 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, F-35I Adir fighter bombers, and Dolphin-class submarines equipped with submarine-launched cruise missiles. This last capability, a virtually invulnerable second strike submarine force, makes Israeli nuclear deterrence practically indestructible, regardless of any first strike against Israeli territory. Hitler not only failed to eliminate the people he sought to destroy, that people went on to build, in the following decades, one of the most sophisticated military capabilities on the planet. The atomic bomb, made by those he expelled. In the autumn of 1938, in the laboratory of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Chemistry in Berlin, radiochemist Otto Hahn and physicist Fritz Strassmann bombarded uranium nuclei with neutrons and obtained a result they could not explain. Instead of capturing the neutron and becoming a heavier element, the nucleus split into 2 fragments of roughly equal mass, releasing an abnormally large amount of energy. Hahn communicated the result to his colleague and former collaborator, Lise Meitner, an Austrian physicist of Jewish origin who had worked for 30 years at the same institute, but had to flee Germany in July 1938. At 59 years old, without a valid passport, crossing the Dutch border clandestinely with a small suitcase, because the Reich's anti-Semitic laws had left her without citizenship and legal protection. Settled in Stockholm at the Nobel Institute of Physics, Meitner analyzed Hahn's data with her nephew, physicist Otto Frisch, during the Christmas holidays of 1938, walking in the snow in the Swedish town of Kungälv, and formulated the correct theoretical explanation of the phenomenon. It was named nuclear fission. Calculations showed that the division of a single uranium nucleus released approximately 200 million times more energy than an ordinary chemical reaction. Meitner never received the Nobel Prize that Hahn was awarded in 1944 for the discovery of fission. The scientific community considered for decades that she had been deliberately excluded. In 1966, the United States government awarded her the Enrico Fermi Award alongside Hahn and Strassmann. In 1997, element 109 of the periodic table was named Meitnerium in her honor. The woman who provided the theoretical key to modern nuclear physics and did so as a refugee expelled by Nazi Germany, today has an eternal element in the periodic table. Himmler, who oversaw her persecution, has none. The chain of expulsions carried out by the Nazi regime from 1933 under the laws for the restoration of the professional civil service and through the Aryan paragraph that implemented them produced the most devastating scientific diaspora in history. In physics and mathematics alone, between 1933 and 1940, more than 200 university-level physicists left Germany and Austria, the majority of whom were Jewish or married to Jews. Science historian Philip Ball has estimated that Germany lost approximately 15% of its total academic community in the early years of the regime. In certain disciplines, theoretical physics, pure mathematics, organic chemistry, the figure was much higher because these areas had a disproportionately high Jewish representation as a result of generations of accumulated academic effort. Albert Einstein, whose work on special relativity and mass energy equivalence, the equation E equals mc squared, formulated in 1905, would be the conceptual foundation for all subsequent nuclear engineering, was in California giving lectures in January 1933. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30th, Einstein declared he would not return to Germany. In March, he renounced his German citizenship and his position at the Prussian Academy of Sciences. In October, he settled permanently at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, where he worked until his death in 1955. The property of his house in Kappeth, near Berlin, was confiscated by the regime. His books were burned in the bonfires of May 1933. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had studied in Berlin under Max Planck and Einstein, patented in 1934 in London the concept of a nuclear chain reaction, the mechanism that makes an atomic bomb possible, while exiled in England. He moved to the United States in 1938. Edward Teller, also Hungarian, had studied in Munich and worked in Göttingen. He left Germany in 1933 after Hitler's rise and ended up in Chicago and later in Los Alamos. Hans Bethe, Nobel Prize winner in 1967 for his theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, had been dismissed from his chair in Tübingen in 1933 for being half Jewish. He emigrated to the United States in 1935 and led the theoretical physics department of the Manhattan Project. Rudolf Peierls, who along with Otto Frisch, Lise Meitner's nephew, drafted the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum in March 1940, the first technical document demonstrating the physical feasibility of building an atomic bomb with a manageable amount of enriched uranium, had been born in Berlin and left Germany in 1933. The Einstein-Szilard letter, dated August 2, 1939, and delivered to President Franklin D. Roosevelt via economist Alexander Sachs on October 11, 1939, warned that recent experiments by Fermi and Szilard make it likely that the element uranium can be converted into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future, and that this could lead to the construction of bombs. It urged the US government to act. Roosevelt created the Uranium Committee 2 days later. The process that led to the Manhattan Project had begun. The letter was signed by a man who had been stripped of his German citizenship and whose property had been confiscated by the same regime that thousands of kilometers away was attempting to build its own bomb. The German Uran Project, the Third Reich's nuclear program, was inaugurated in September 1939 under the direction of the Reich Research Council and entrusted to a team including Werner Heisenberg, who had remained in Germany and whose relationship with the regime is still a subject of historical debate. At the June 1942 meeting in Berlin between Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and Armaments Minister Albert Speer, the program was evaluated. A bomb was theoretically possible, but would require years of development, which under prevailing wartime conditions was not feasible. Kershaw documents that Speer communicated this assessment to Hitler. Hitler, already aware in general terms of the theoretical feasibility of an atomic bomb in the distant future, took Speer's report as confirmation that he would never live to see it deployed and that it could play no role in the current war. Consequently, it was not given resource priority. The German program also made a critical miscalculation. Heisenberg incorrectly calculated the critical mass of uranium-235 required for an explosive chain reaction, overestimating it by several orders of magnitude. Science historian Jeremy Bernstein and other researchers have extensively analyzed the transcripts of private conversations of the German physicists captured at Farm Hall, the English manor where they were interned in 1945, secretly recorded by British intelligence. Those transcripts show that when Heisenberg learned of the Hiroshima bombing on August 6, 1945, his first reaction was disbelief. He could not believe that the Americans had achieved something he had considered technically unfeasible in the short term. The exile of the world's best German-speaking nuclear physicists had left the German program not only without critical human resources, but without the accumulation of tacit knowledge that is generated only when the best minds work together on the same problem for years. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 a.m. in the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico, the first atomic bomb in history, codenamed Gadget with a plutonium core, detonated with an energy equivalent to approximately 21 kilotons of TNT. The codename for the test was Trinity, chosen by the project's scientific director J. Robert Oppenheimer, who upon witnessing the explosion quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The flash was visible from 350 kilometers away. The temperature at the detonation point instantly exceeded that of the surface of the sun. A 30-meter steel tower was vaporized in microseconds. Oppenheimer had been born in New York to a Jewish family of German origin. His father, Julius Oppenheimer, had emigrated from Hanau, Hesse, in 1888. The man who led the construction of the atomic bomb was the grandson of German Jews. The physicists who calculated its design, those who demonstrated its theoretical feasibility, those who designed the detonation systems, those who analyzed the fission products. A disproportionately large fraction of all of them were European Jews whom the Nazi regime had expelled from their universities, laboratories, and countries between 1933 and 1941. Kershaw is direct in his assessment. It is so fortunate that the bomb was not available. Hitler would not have hesitated for a moment to drop it on London and Moscow. The man who died waiting for his miracle weapons in the Berlin bunker remained unaware until the end that the only real miracle weapon of the war had been built by the children and grandchildren of the people he tried to exterminate using the physical principles discovered by the scientist whom his regime expelled at 59 years old into the snow of the Dutch border. Women, from the kitchen to Parliament and the Chancellery. The woman has her own battlefield. With every child she brings into the world, she fights her battle for the nation. This phrase, spoken by Hitler at the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg in 1934 and representative of dozens of similar statements, summarized a state policy that was neither accidental nor peripheral to the Nazi project. It was structural. Hitler's vision of the role of women emerged from his deepest ideological formation. In Mein Kampf, marriage does not appear as a social contract between people, but as an instrument of racial preservation. He wrote that a racially oriented state will have to elevate marriage from the level of constant racial contamination and bless it as the institution designated to reproduce humanity in the image of the Lord, not monsters that are half man and half ape. In that scheme, the woman was the biological vehicle of racial purity. Her social function was reproductive and domestic. Everything else was deviation. This vision had a psychological root documented by his own chief biographer. Ian Kershaw records that the young Hitler in Vienna was described by his roommate August Kubizek as openly misogynistic. He took satisfaction in noting that women could not sit in the stalls of the Vienna Opera House. In his own words, Hitler described his feminine ideal as a small, adorable, naive creature, tender, sweet, and stupid. Kershaw adds that his assertion that a woman would prefer to bow to a strong man than dominate a weak one may well have been a compensatory projection of his own sexual complexes. The political decisions he made regarding women's role in the Reich were not merely abstract ideology, they reflected a deep and coherent psychological structure. The April 1933 laws for the restoration of the professional civil service were the first legal instruments of exclusion. Female doctors, lawyers, judges, university professors, and civil servants were systematically dismissed under the Aryan paragraph and specific provisions restricting women's access to public office. The number of women enrolled in German universities, which had steadily grown during the Weimar Republic to represent approximately 18% of the student body, was limited by quotas to 10% of total enrollment in 1933. The marriage loan law of the same year offered loans to newly married couples if the woman left the workforce, on the condition that a quarter of the loan would be forgiven for each child born, explicitly turning motherhood into an economic transaction with the state. The NS-Frauenschaft, the League of National Socialist Women, led by Gertrude Scholz-Klink from 1934 to 1945, had approximately 6 million female members in 1939. Its function was not to empower women within the Nazi system. It was to indoctrinate them into the role assigned by the regime. Scholz-Klink, who became known as the first woman of the Reich, was never invited to cabinet meetings nor consulted on any significant political decision. Her position was a performance of female inclusion within a system designed to exclude them from any real power. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, trained young girls from the age of 10 in values of obedience, physical health oriented toward motherhood and domestic self-sacrifice. The explicit curriculum prioritized physical education over mathematics and science. The internal contradiction of the system surfaced during the war. In the spring of 1942, when casualties on the Eastern Front began creating a critical shortage of industrial labor, Ministers Goebbels and Sauckel proposed the forced mobilization of women. Hitler flatly rejected it. Kershaw documents that in January 1943, faced with the catastrophe at Stalingrad and with 11 million men already under arms, Hitler was finally forced to sign a decree ordering women between 17 and 50 to report for the war effort. The result was mediocre. Of the 8.6 million women employed at the end of 1942, only 968,000 worked in the armaments industry. Ideology had sabotaged the Reich's productive capacity at the most critical moment of the war. The Lebensborn program, initiated by Heinrich Himmler under SS administration in December 1935, illustrates the extent of the state's instrumentalization of motherhood. Lebensborn houses were facilities where single, racially suitable women, evaluated according to physical and genealogical criteria by SS doctors, could give birth to children of SS fathers without the social stigma that traditional Germany attached to motherhood outside of marriage. The state covered medical expenses, guaranteed the mother's anonymity if desired, and registered the children as Reich citizens with documented genealogy. Approximately 8,000 children were born in Lebensborn facilities in Germany between 1935 and 1945. During the occupation of Norway, the program was expanded. Houses were established in Norwegian territory, where between 8,000 and 12,000 children of German fathers were born, many resulting from relationships between Wehrmacht soldiers and Norwegian women. These children, derogatorily called Tiskerunge, German bastards, suffered severe discrimination in post-war Norway, an episode of injustice formally recognized by Norway in 2005. The Reich's labor policy toward women also had a racial dimension that distinguishes it from any ordinary conservatism. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, hastily drafted during the Party Congress by officials working until 2 a.m. of September 15th without explicit reference to any prior legal instrument, prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and German citizens, including specific provisions forbidding Jews from employing German women under 45 in their households. The racial purity of German women was simultaneously a matter of domestic and foreign policy. Their bodies were the battlefield where the racial battle was won or lost. Kershaw observes that these laws emerged from an internal tension between party radicals who wanted immediate action and conservatives like Schacht who sought legal regularization of existing discrimination. Hitler opted for the latter approach at that moment. The result was equally devastating. Angela Merkel was born on July 17, 1954 in Hamburg, exactly 9 years after the end of the war. She grew up in communist East Germany. Her father was a Lutheran pastor who had moved east for political conviction. and studied physics at Karl Marx University in Leipzig, where she earned her doctorate in 1986 with a thesis on quantum chemistry. She worked at the Central Institute of Chemistry and Physics of the GDR Academy of Sciences until the fall of the wall. In the 16 years she governed Germany as Chancellor, she managed the 2008 financial crisis, when Germany kept unemployment below 6% while Southern Europe collapsed, led the European response to the Euro crisis, and in September 2015 made the unilateral decision to keep Germany's borders open for Syrian refugees arriving via Hungary, allowing over 1 million people to enter in 1 year. The phrase she used to defend it, "Wir schaffen das," we can do it, became one of the most cited political statements of 21st century Europe. In terms that make the contrast with the Nazi vision more visible, Merkel was Chancellor longer than any other Western democratic leader in the 21st century, managed Europe's largest economy with unemployment rates reaching historic lows of 3% in 2019, and did so as a physics doctorate educated at a university in the communist bloc, the daughter of a Protestant clergyman divorced and remarried. She simultaneously embodied everything the Nazi project considered incompatible with the natural order: a woman in the highest office, a scientist with her own established career before politics, who actively supported the German Jewish community and on multiple occasions visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem, as an official state act. The Bundestag, elected in September 2021, set a record with 34.9% of seats held by women, 257 of 736 deputies. Between 2021 and 2025, Chancellor Olaf Scholz's federal cabinet included 8 female ministers out of 16 portfolios, including defense. Christine Lambrecht until January 2023, followed by Boris Pistorius, but with precedent set by Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer between 2019 and 2021, Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock of the Green Party, and Interior Nancy Faeser. The president of the Bundestag since 2021 is Bärbel Baas of the Social Democratic Party. Female representation in the German parliament is not an artificially imposed quota. It is the result of decades of internal parity laws within parties and deep cultural transformations in the conception of political leadership. German democracy, the system he destroyed and that survived. On March 23, 1933, at 2 p.m., the Reichstag met in the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, surrounded by SA and SS units in combat uniforms. Inside, the 441 deputies present, the 81 communist deputies had been arrested or were in hiding, and 26 Social Democrats were under police custody, voted on the Enabling Act, which granted Hitler's government full legislative powers without the need for parliamentary approval. Only the Social Democratic Party, with its remaining 94 deputies, voted against it. Its leader, Otto Wels, delivered the bravest speech of 20th century Germany: "You can take away our freedom and our lives, but not our honor." Weimar democracy had been destroyed from within, using its own procedures, with the support of parties that believed they could control Hitler once in power. Professor Kershaw documents in detail how the system surrendered itself. Conservatives from the German National Party and the Zentrum voted for the Enabling Act, believing they would function as counterweights to the Chancellor. Within months, all their parties had been dissolved or had presented their self-dissolution. The Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, promulgated on May 23, 1949, was specifically drafted so that what happened in 1933 could not be repeated. Article 79, paragraph 3, the so-called Eternity Clause, establishes that certain constitutional principles are immutable. Human dignity, the federal structure of the state, the participation of the lender in legislation. Article 21 allows the prohibition of parties whose activities threaten the democratic order. The Federal Constitutional Court, based in Karlsruhe and composed of 16 judges elected by the Bundestag and the Bundesrat, can declare unconstitutional any law that violates these principles, even if approved by a parliamentary majority. German democracy does not function in spite of its history. It functions in part because of it. The country is the only one in the world that has incorporated into its legal architecture a memory of its own democratic failure as an active protection mechanism. The Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the Verfassungsschutz, monitors and can investigate far-right, far-left and jihadist organizations that represent threats to the constitutional order. Since 1994, the public display of Nazi symbols, the swastika, the Hitler salute, SS runes, is punishable by up to 3 years in prison under Article 86 of the German Penal Code. The final paradox that Hitler would have to face is this: the political system he considered degenerate, weak, and instrumentalized by his enemies, liberal democracy, proved to be robust enough to rebuild the country he had destroyed, turn it into the largest economy in Europe and one of the 15 countries with the highest standard of living on the planet. And it did so without a Führer, without a pure race, without conquered living space, and without wars of aggression. Exactly the opposite of everything he had preached.